Andre Cilliers with Treasury One. Yo, what a week we've had, Andre. And in your end of the world, in currency markets, I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this before, but having a word with David Shapiro a little earlier, he said, and he's very old, he said in his lifetime, he never expected to see what he has seen in the past week. How did the currency markets react?
Well, very immediate, but that's typical with markets. It's very, very immediate. And we could see very immediately on the reaction of the rand. But that was not the biggest weakening that I've seen in my history. Having been around in 1985, when Mr. P.W. Botha had the Rubicon speech, and we were closed down for 2 days, and that's where the debt standstill was announced, and the rescheduling of South African debt. The turmoil then was much bigger than it was this period. If we look at the move when Mr. Zuma announced the appointment of Mr. Des van Rooyen as the new Minister of Finance, the immediate reaction was also bigger. We should not forget that that was where we traded in the 14s or the 13s, lower 14s, and we jumped up as high as 16 before that decision was reversed and Mr. Pravin Gordhan was appointed. So no, yes, it was turmoil, yes, it was chaotic, but it was not the worst that the markets had seen.
And that's the thing that's surprising so many people. On the ground, this is unprecedented. And yet in the financial markets, and in particular with the rand, where it should have been reflected, it hasn't been. So what is it telling us?
This is telling us that the rand as a barometer of what happens in South Africa is very important, and that it reacts very quickly, and that we need to get our house in order and to get rid of these quick, dirty events that influences so much and then damages our investor confidence on a long-term basis. You know, the event takes place for 3 days. The consequences stays with us for years and years thereafter. We are now seeing that Toyota issued a letter delivered to the mayor of Durban City, eThekwini, received that letter where they express the concern about what happens in KwaZulu-Natal and specifically in the Durban area, and how damaging that is for companies and the prospects of companies, and how they start doubting whether they should put any investment into the country. But that spills over and it's got long-term effects, and that's what we need to get right in this country. We cannot afford this. Our growth figures cannot afford it. Our currency cannot support these kind of moves, and we need to get our house in order and get rid of it.
But why is the currency so? Is it not? You can't say it shrugged it off, because it went down a little. But you would have imagined that where you have a situation of attempted sedition, where there have been MPs attacking shopping centres, shooting out the firefighting equipment first so that they can burn the shopping centres after the looting, where you have 220 people who've been murdered as a consequence of this, where you have a president who is saying that this is a plot, and many people who have insight say, yes, it is an attempted coup d'etat. And yet the rand continues to go as relatively strongly. These are mysterious times, and I suppose mysterious or bemused citizens who looking at it and wondering, what is it that is going to finally make the penny drop internationally, if not locally?
Well, I think the penny is starting to drop internationally. If we look at the investment and fixed direct investment into South Africa over the last number of months, last couple of years, it tells us that we are not one of the emerging markets that attracts the most money. We actually are a little bit behind the averages. And if we look at our figures that came in previous years compared to what comes in now, then the investor community is already telling us what they think. I think the markets are a little bit mature, more mature than it was previously, and I think there's a little bit more depth in the markets. But what was also heartening coming out fairly quickly last week was the fact that within communities itself, there was some resistance. And that, I think, send a message that it's a minority doing these things and that the majority is actually supporting a better rule, a better democratic society, and are actually rallying behind Mr. Ramaphosa as the leader. You know, he admitted that they made mistakes, and yes, they did. Um, but that's what you also expect of a leader, to admit when mistakes was made and correct them. And I think they had a very, very tight rope to run because, you know, if you handled it incorrectly, it could very easily have spilled over into a second, in inverted commas, Marikana, which was avoided. The bloodshed that there was, the killings that there was mostly within the lootings itself. It was not the police firing people, shooting people. It was from injuries and deaths by the looters themselves, where most people was killed and trampled. Um, and so generally, I don't think it was handled too badly. And after his consultations with other parties, religious parties, other political parties, etc., he addressed the nation again, and things looked a little bit better, as I say, from resistance within own communities. And I think that helped.
Yeah, but the resistance in own communities has led to a lot of vigilantism. 20 people shot in Phoenix, I mean, you've seen the social media. The reason why the country held had nothing to do with the police, who were absent for 4 days, had everything to do with the communities who banded together and defended themselves. That's not a civilized society. And that's why I
No,
don't understand why none of this is kind of clicking yet in the global communities.
that's not a civil society, but I think that's a consequence, and that's something that will happen. Um, I think at the same time, we also had some international news that distracted people a little bit from what happened in South Africa. If we look at the floods that happened in Germany, in Belgium, and Netherlands, I think that sort of put us a little bit on the behind of international news, where that was the focus. That is a very important part of the world, a very big contributor to world economies, and I think that was at the same time. Mr. Powell also spoke and reiterated that the Federal Reserve will not immediately do anything on interest rates, and I think those two events sort of distracted a little bit from what happened in South Africa. And by the time that was on the forefront, the looting was getting a little bit more under control. And I think that sort of took a little bit of a back end. But I don't think it's over. And over the next week or three, depending on how it works out and what happens and what is being said, and what ratings agencies and other investors put out their feelers as to what happens, it will come back to the forefront. So this is by no means over, and definitely not a time to sit back and think that it's behind us. It's still very much at the forefront, and it's a time where we have to make immediate and drastic decisions as to how it's going to be handled forward. But I think we got some reprieve, as I said, from international events as
I
well.
think that's very well put, Andre, because we live here in South Africa. We have family and friends who have been at the forefront of all of this. We know the stories. We see it on social media. We see it on our television screens. To us, we live it. To people elsewhere in the world, well, it's a country that is high risk anyway. From time to time, you'd expect things to spark. So I guess we can be a little navel gazed and think that the center of the world is in the southern tip of Africa, but actually the world's got a heck of a lot of other things going on in its mind at the moment. But your final point is really a good one, that we need to now be doing the right thing so that this does not continue, because if it continues, presumably that would start changing the mindset of the international community.
We need to change the moral compass of people in South Africa. We cannot run into streets looting and stealing and having criminal activity all the time. But to change that, we need to create jobs. We need to change the gap in the bridge, and we build a bridge from between the rich and the poor. We need to get people in jobs. We need to create jobs. And we need to give people some dignity. If we don't do that, we don't get that right, then these things are things that will happen every 2 and 3 years. We will have this kind of thing that happens to us, and it will not build any long-term investor confidence. So we need to work together as private sector and government in changing how things are done in South Africa.